Yeah, so this morning I'd like to turn to this work that I did on prepositions. So yesterday I told you that in our initial research, people didn't find the conception of calling and vocation all that compelling. I think that's largely because we've lost both the theology and practice of vocation in the Christian community. And also we've had really strong secular interpretations of calling come forth. So I really felt like as a practical theologian, I needed to really go to work on this. What would it mean to retrieve this language, to retrieve the practice? How could we make it compelling and reframe it? So I didn't think it was so much as a noun or as a verb. I wanted to show the relationality. Well, you'll probably appreciate this because you're all public speakers, but I came up with prepositions initially just as like a hook that when I went out and talked about vocation, they were just like really easy ways to provide a framework. And then I went to write the book and I had looked up the definition of a preposition, and it's the smallest words in the English language that express relationship. And I thought, well, that's what I'm after. I really think what's essential about the experience and the life of calling and vocation is that it's both vertical, it's deeply relational in relationship to God, and it's horizontal, it's in relationship to each other. So I wanted to find a way to talk about that. So I use these 8 prepositions, by, to, as, for, through, from, in, and within, as a way to, I wanted to kind of crack open and kind of break apart some of the, strong assumptions and molds we had about calling, and see if working with the language didn't do something with it. So what I'd like to do this morning is I'm going to work with by, to, and as first, and then we'll have some small group discussion. Then I'm going to do for and through, more small group discussion, and then the from and in, really different frames, I think, than have been used. And if we have time, we'll have a small group discussion, but I'm not sure that we will. So we'll just see where we are time-wise. In fact, I should be keeping track of the time. Okay, I got it.
Gotcha.
Sorry about that. Okay, bye. Well, Brueggemann says that the dynamic interaction of calling is really between the one who calls us and the one who's called, and that agenda becomes what's called a calling. So I think in large part, people don't experience God as a caller because there's something missing fundamentally. They're not in that relationship or in that dialogue, at least in a strong enough way over time, so that when it comes to discerning a call or sensing that callings are coming in their life or ending, callings do end, that they have a sense of what God is doing or inviting them to. So I think this whole issue of who God is as a caller is fundamental. And I mentioned yesterday that in our research, we found 3 dominant images or metaphors. One I likened to the acorn. So most people thought that God had a very strong plan for their life. Actually, some people did. A few people did. Stories like, from first grade, I just knew I was to be a singer, or I would do something with music. Or since I was young, Margaret O'Gara, if you know Margaret, she was at the Toronto School of Theology for a long time, a Catholic ecumenist. She told me that since she was a child, she felt called to be a reformer of the church. And now, people didn't have specific ways that they thought that was going to be lived out, but they had a strong sense early on. But the majority of our interviews, and still of people that we've worked with in congregations, find that the language of pilgrimage was much more dominant theme. That there were fits and starts, that they set out for a destination, but they got sick along the way, or they got lost, or they met up with a group of people they didn't imagine, and they started to do things that weren't part of the plan. And so they had a much more messy story of calling and vocation, much more with fits and starts. So this metaphor spoke with people along the way. And then the third one was this kind of aha moment. Some people reported to us kind of a convergence, a moment when kind of things would come together in their life. And they had a strong sense of, oh, like this is who I am, or this is what I am to do. And I'd like to show you a video that exemplifies this. Martin, you want to show that video? Oh, I got to stop sharing. Okay. He just needs to pull up the other slide for us. Martin, I don't have any volume.
It's been a lifelong desire to do different things with wood. And I, as a young boy, would spend time walking through the woods and looking at the trees and trying to imagine what they were like in size and which ones I would cut up and use for lumber later. I didn't realize at the time how important that was to me. It was later in life that I look back and I say, wow, that's where it all started. And I would take my mother's peach crates and I would pull them apart and figure out different little things I could make out of them, toys or buildings. You know, all I had was a little handsaw maybe and a hammer and some nails, but I got pretty creative with what I could do with it. There was always that desire to do something with wood. In high school, I took a wood class and I was just fascinated by what I could do making a simple breadboard. Just fascinated the heck out of me. Later in life, I took a class on whittling, and this was when after I had gotten married, and I was teaching in a high school, and it was an evening class, and all we had to do was cut little notches on a piece of wood the first night. And I remember coming home and sitting there at the table, cutting these notches on the wood, just trying to get them all even, and getting used to using a knife and a piece of wood. And I was so excited. It was like my spirit was just jumping inside with, you found it. You finally found it. This is what you want. This is what you are to do. But at the time, I figured, well, this will be just like I tried to learn how to play guitar and I tried to learn how to play tennis, and it would last for a few months and die off. But this never died. It just kept growing and growing, and people would give me encouragement. Basically, it took off by itself, and I just kept feeding it and ended up where I am today.
Thanks, Martin. Well, this story of Ken's story about woodworking is really intriguing to me, because not only does he have this aha experience, this conversion, and the beautiful way that he describes, the spirit was jumping inside of me. He has that come together in many ways, both with a sense of this wanting to work with wood from his childhood. There's a little bit of the acorn there. And if you knew his whole story, a bit of the pilgrimage too. So I think his experience captures well some of these ways in which we've heard people talk about how they hear God calling them to something. So I'm going to ask you in your small groups just to think about kind of what metaphors or images of God as a caller have appeared to you. We've heard people talk about, they wonder if God doesn't kind of work like a GPS. Sometimes you have to calibrate it every so often so that God kind of helps you end up where you end up. Or one person talked about God as my coach, again, a contemporary metaphor image. Or somebody said, God's like a dealer in a poker game. He wants you all in. You have to surrender, completely. So people really had quite imaginative ways of talking about God as the caller. I think what I learned and what I've learned across all these stories is there's no single or right way. And if we think of God speaking to us or being with us or revealing God's self to us only in one way, we've kind of put God in a box. So God's call comes in a whole variety of ways, by conversations with other people or by trying out different jobs or areas of study if we're younger, or sometimes by realizing what we can't do, what we're not good at, or by looking back at our lives, or by just following a way forward as faithfully as we can. Okay, so the preposition to. Well, this is kind of an obvious preposition because it's the primary way we use the language of vocation. God calls me to, marry Don, or to teach at St. John's, or to become a theologian. To is directional. It's toward, to people, places, or situations, or something. And I just want to reiterate, yesterday, the story I told you about kind of my awakening to Luther's understanding of vocation. If I brushed over that, I'm sorry, I can come back to it now. But Luther basically, I'm probably telling a whole room of Protestants this, aren't I? Anyway, I'll plunge forward. Luther's great insight. Luther lived in a highly stratified medieval society. And there were callings that were supposedly higher than others. And he kind of just leveled that by saying, no, through baptism, we become the priesthood of all believers. We share the same identity in Christ. We are one in Christ from our baptism. And our fundamental vocation and calling is communal, is as a community. And out of that, so I use my to preposition to try to drive at that. What is that communal calling that we share? And how do we discern that as a community? And I think in the New Testament, I'm using some images here, by the way, from the St. John's Bible, if you're familiar with that. This is the call to the disciples painting, or illumination, excuse me. I think primarily Jesus calls us to be a community of disciples. And in fact, the term disciples is used primarily as a plural, not as a singular in the New Testament. So I think Jesus has this notion of calling the disciples to himself to follow. And we have to figure that out together, what that following entails. Of course, in his time, there were many teachers that had disciples, and they could follow one for a while and follow another. But Jesus' interpretation of discipleship is pretty radical. You have to completely change your heart and mind. You have to give up a lot of loyalties, job, family, friends, nation, and embrace his way of life. And it's lifelong, right? And it's lifelong. And it might entail persecution. So I like this image of the church as a community of disciples that are following Christ on the way. Roberto Gozueto's a Hispanic theologian at Boston College, and he says that community is the birthplace of the self. So the way that we make meaning of our lives, the way that we understand and forge our own identity and sense of self, is by and through community, and by and through being connected to the people that we are. So calling is fundamentally communal, and connected with other people's callings. Okay, let's take a look at as. With this preposition, I'm trying to get at the particularity of each of us. So if to harkens Luther's idea of the general calling, as I'm trying to get at the particular callings. God calls me as the particular person that I am. Etta Hannenberg, a Catholic theologian, states that vocation is my person. I'm a unique creation placed by God at this particular time, at this place, with these abilities, disabilities, experiences, God's divine summons is to me, and my response can't be but out of the particularities that together shape my context and constitution. So, yeah, I'm a white woman born in North America, in the United States, in Iowa. I was born in Iowa, actually, in the Midwest. In the 1960s, I have these parents, these sisters. I married this guy. I got this mother-in-law. So it's all the particularities of my life constitute the location, the context, the space where I live out my callings. And I'll come back around to Luther's notion about this when I do the preposition in, but I did not want to retrieve Luther's understanding of, just in the place that I am as a static place. No, whatever that place is where you are is the place of agency, regardless of your conditions or life context. And at least in the Christian life, we do have a sense that the Spirit moves within us, gives us the gifts to live out the callings where God calls us at the time. So with the preposition as, we examined the lifespan. We looked at children. We looked at the nature of play and work in the life of children. We spent a lot of time on young people. I like Joyce's idea that God calls young people as the people they are, with life purposes as youth, not in spite of their age, but because of it. So I think she's challenging here the notion that we sometimes treat youth and teens as getting ready for their vocation instead of saying, what is God calling them to now? And we talked a little bit about young adults yesterday. What we did with adulthood is we looked at 4 phases of adulthood: young adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood, and older adulthood. And the reason we did that was largely because of the developmental research on adulthood. We're living longer. All groups are living longer, but we're not going to be older adults longer. We're not going to be very old longer, okay? We are going to be adults longer. And that's why this transition from middle adulthood to late adulthood is such a pivotal vocational moment. We said yesterday, one marker of that is retirement. Now, that term is really loaded, and we got it in the United States in the late 1940s when we created Social Security. And then you retire at 65 and you get this benefit. Well, that made sense, when most people were going to die when they were 67, 68, or 69. No, now we live 30 years longer after our, whatever retirement from full-time work looks like, a third of our life. So developmental psychologists are talking about this as another stage of adulthood. And as I said, so when I talk about this, I try to use the language of retirement as the time in adulthood when you leave full-time work. Okay, you don't have the same job responsibilities as you did, regardless of what that job might be. Now, that's important because most people, at least in the United States, I don't know about Canada, go back to work part-time. That is much of the activity in late adulthood continues into, and from middle adulthood continues into late adulthood. But by late adulthood, I mean we're marked by experiences of becoming grandparents, leaving full-time work, perhaps facing chronic illness. We also treated adulthood not, it is chronological, obviously, but not by age. Age, certainly, people can live into late adulthood long into their, up until in their 90s, if they have not faced major transitions of health or of moving. So, and of course, it's these transition points along the way that are so piercingly vocational, or a heightened sense of what's God calling me to now. Well, someone asked me yesterday about privilege, and that question always comes up. It's very important because if we have this mindset that vocation is all about choice, we have lopped off all those kinds of experiences where we don't have choice. So I'm going to deal with that a little bit more in the preposition in, but I just want to note the really important work of Patrick Rahe's. If you don't know him, he is at the Forum for Theological Exploration in Atlanta, and he wrote a book, Nobody Cries When We Die, God, Community, and Surviving into Adulthood. And when we started working on this topic, there were not a lot of theologians of color who were really writing autobiographically or, doing systematic theological work on it. But Rahe's is one of the first Hispanic theologians I've really framed his life story as a calling story. And in his childhood, he says that, basically his first calling as a child was simply a call to live, to survive. He said, countless times when I could have died or my soul could have perished under the weight of violence in the world around me. For me, in these instances, vocation has meant God calling me to live. Only when I was finally given the freedom and space to discern what living into a full human flourishing life looks like, was I able to discern a call to do or be anything other than just alive. He said, the first call for many persons of color in our country is the survival to adulthood, of which, of course, many young men don't survive. So I'll come back around to Rahe's story in a bit as well. But this gives us at least some language or some life experience to help us break open. Tell me your story. Tell me where you experienced God's calling. What did God call you to? And how did that happen to you? What I try to do in this work is I let people tell me if something is a calling or not. I don't try to label it first. And so I think Rahe's story points out to us how important it is to let people tell us where that calling rests as the person that they are. Okay, so let's take a little moment here now. We're going to put you into groups again. So those of you in the room can talk to next to each other, and the Zoom people will go on Zoom. So I'd like you to think about your call to ministry now. Consider the first time you felt called to ministry. And in terms of those three images, do any of those speak to your experience, or is there another image that fits better? And then how do you think about the relationship between the call to discipleship, or the communal call, and individual callings for yourself and your community? And then really considering your ministry now, where are you on that lifespan journey? How is God calling you as the person you are today, with your gifts, your limitations, your age, your context, your abilities? Where is that for you? Okay, we'll take about 10 minutes for that discussion. Okay, let's take some time to examine two more prepositions. The preposition for does a lot of work for us, and I introduced it a little bit yesterday. And I primarily use it as a way to talk about work, or to talk about doing something, work in the broadest sense. I'd like to return to our conversation about ministry yesterday, or the story that I started out with, how I would try to describe to ministry students what ministry is, okay? So first, why ministry? And what constitutes this call to ministry? Why is there such a thing as ministry in the church? And well, if I was there in person, I'd have this conversation with you, but I'm going to keep going if you don't mind. And then you can discuss this in your small groups afterwards. So my answer to why ministry, what constitutes the call to ministry, is that back to Luther's notion, or this fundamental notion that we exist first and foremost as disciples who share in the life of community. And then I have these different ways of talking about discipleship, which I'm not going to go into. but we share this common life of discipleship. And so I'll often ask my students, do all Christians have callings? And, most of them will finally say yes, they think so. They're not always sure, but okay, yeah. I think I've convinced you today. I hope so, that all Christians have callings. And then here's a tricky question. And we could probably talk about this all morning. I hope you do into lunch. Are all Christians called to ministry or only some? And this might differ by our tradition. I know Episcopalians use the language for ministry really different than we do in the Catholic community. And that's okay. Okay. My point here. So I answered this question. No, all Christians are not called to ministry. And because I was trying to get my students to see there's something distinctive about the call to ministry. I'm not trying to claim it's higher or better than other callings, or it's the only calling. I'm trying to say it's a distinct calling. And if it's distinct, we have to figure out what's distinctive about it if we're discerning whether we're called into this kind of work and service in the church and in the world. Okay, so then we did this already. Okay, so particular callings can be discerned around 3 questions. And I like the way Michael Hines does this. Is this a source of joy for you? So when you're doing this, do you feel joyful? Does it tap into your gifts and talents? And is it of genuine service? Or as he says, does it bring you joy? Are you good at it? And does anybody really care? So what he's trying to get at here is the nexus between the joy, not as happiness, in other words, not as pleasure, like my husband made scones this morning and they were really good. It made me happy. Joy is distinct. Christian joy is. Joy is a certain kind of rightness, a wholeness, an integrity. I know it. It's right for me. It's a coming together of who I am, even if there is suffering. Joy is not the absence of suffering. Okay. In fact, it might entail a great deal of suffering. Okay. So joy, gifts. We started talking about that yesterday a little bit, and service. So this is the way I started to frame the preposition of vocation. The Greek word for joy comes from comes from this close to the word of charism. It's the natural reaction to the work of God. It is that abiding sense. It harkens on this grace, this goodness, this giftedness. Okay, so this is the image of St. Paul from the St. John's Bible, by the way. So what's Paul say about gifts? He says there are 2 kinds. There are universal ones, like faith, hope, and charity. And then there are these particular ones, second ones, which he calls charisms, also from the Greek word for grace. It's a gift. It's a gift that is given by God that comes through us for others. So it's not for my own self-development. It's not for my own possession. It's not to build my resume, it's for you. It's for you. That's the sign of a gift. And Paul emphasizes freely given, not merited, not rewarded, just because of God's sheer love for us. Grace is God's powerful, invitation into relationship, into empowering us to do things, as ambassadors of Christ, Paul would say. So it's not a possession or an object. It's a dynamic movement. Now he says there's no Christian who's exempt from charisms. We all receive some gifts from the Spirit. No one receives all of them. That's important. Good for those discerning the call to ministry. They don't have all the gifts. Nor does any person only receive one. Each person experiences a unique combination of gifts over time, kind of like the human genome. That's kind of how I think about it. And they come and they go. They come and they go. Maybe we're born with some, and but we're given new gifts along the way, and some can end. And I'll talk about that when we talk about the preposition from. But Paul's trying to point out here that the Spirit gives us gifts for the good of the community. Okay, so in acting on those gifts is a way of building up the body. And so if we notice that maybe something is ending in our lives, it may be that that's been enough of the way that we've served that community for that amount of time. So Paul's teaching, you know Paul on this. There are a variety of gifts, but the same service, a variety of services, but the same Lord. And these gifts are for the common good. And it's what makes the Christian community diverse, right? We all have different gifts. I do think, too, I'd like to make a further ecclesial and pneumatological claim, and that is where the church is constituted, the Spirit entrusts it with the gifts it needs, both for living the life of discipleship and for the full practice of ministry. I'll say that again. Where the church is constituted, the Spirit ensures that the gifts for living the life of discipleship and for the practice of ministry are ensured. The gifts are there. I mean, we do all kinds of things to block that. Okay. So is your present ministry a source of joy, an expression of your gifts, a service to the common good? Okay, so I want to get back to my question then. So what constitutes the call to ministry, and how is it distinct from discipleship? Because I'm trying to claim not all disciples are ministers. All ministers are disciples, right? This fundamental sharing in the baptism of Christ. And all disciples have particular callings, and I'm trying to argue some are called to ministry. But how do we know that? How do we know? How do we know if that's the case? My argument is basically back to charisms. So, okay, I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to give you a definition. And anyway, I'm going to give you a definition. So I said the ministry is leading disciples through teaching, leading worship and prayer, that part of our life together, preaching the word, offering pastoral care for the sick, care for the dying, care for all the needs of people, social ministry, and administration. So my emphasis here is on leading disciples through these practices. So in discerning a call to ministry, we're looking for those people that have the gifts for these 6 things. Not that you get all of them, not that you're great at all 6 of these. Really good ministers know where their gifts lie and know where to call forth other ministers or disciples to help lead in that way. Does that make sense? So I don't think that everyone called into ministry has all these things. I can see in my students, some are really great at catechesis. Some are really great at leading worship. They're not so good at pastoral care. Well, if they become the pastor of the parish or the lay minister in that parish, they're responsible for making sure the ministry of pastoral care takes place. That's a leadership kind of capacity. Okay, there they are. Might want to think, what gifts do you have in relationship to those 6? And you might think of others. I'm happy to entertain others. Now, these 6 practices of ministry exist for the sake of discipleship, lived in relationship to God's mission in the world. We kind of talked about that. As a public act, discernible in word, deed, and symbol. Okay, yeah, I know this is really definitional, but what I'm trying to get at here is, what's the difference if my sister goes and visits somebody in the hospital and the pastor of the church goes and visits? So, my students like to say things like, well, St. Francis said, preach the word and preach the gospel and sometimes use words. And I say, yeah, well, you're called to preach the gospel with words. So ministry is a public act. People should know when you're doing it. There should be something discernible about who you are and what you're doing, because you're doing it on behalf of the Christian community. So when you go to visit the sick in the hospital, as the pastor of my church, you're representing all of us. You represent the body, but I can go as a disciple and visit somebody in the church, but there's a different set of relationships there. Well, I'll just finish this off. As a gift received through faith and baptism, charism and vocation, that's acknowledged by a community through commissioning, installation, ordination. Those are some of the categories in my church right now. But here I'm trying to emphasize that the call of ministry is rooted in that general calling of faith and baptism, but we're looking for the particular charisms that are connected to these practices. That's a way to discern. Do I have a call to this ministry? Am I capable of doing it? Is the Spirit working it in me? Charisms don't come to us already made, okay, maybe Mozart was great at playing the piano at 5 or writing a symphony, I guess, at 5. But no, most of us, we have the sense, well, I'm good at this, or we try to encourage somebody, you're really good with young people, or you really have a great speaking voice, or you have a wonderful singing presence. Come here. Have you ever thought of doing X? We have these I have a Haitian student in my class this semester, and he told this powerful story of his mother asking him at the age of 13 to pray in her Bible study group. And he stands up and says a prayer. And then a couple more months, the pastor asks him to preach. And so here's recognized in this young person, some of these qualities we might say are nascent. They're just maybe there, but in an unformed way. And it's incumbent upon us as the community to form them along the way. Now, I said to you yesterday, people are coming to theological school not having discerned if they have a call to ministry. But so they're early in that discernment process, but it's upon us to help them see, do you have some of the gifts and charisms for these practices? And okay, so ministry entails, like any other type of professional work in the world, a body of knowledge, a set of skills. You belong to a community of practitioners and it exists for the common good. This is a very old understanding of professions in the West. Professions, the idea of being called to a profession, type of professional work in the world, whether you're a dentist or an engineer or a doctor, and of course the 3 traditional professions were ministry, law, and medicine, is that these 4 capacities, these 4 qualities are present. And of course, a profession is based on the notion of you profess to do this work on behalf of and for the good of others. So you have some expertise. That's why I don't think everybody's called to ministry. I think some people are theologically because they've been given the charisms to carry out this work on behalf of the community and for the sake of the community. But other people are given other skills and gifts. I'll tell you what, I don't have the knowledge or the skill to be an engineer or to be I probably wouldn't be a very good clerk at Target, or I probably wouldn't be very good at working in a bank, but my mom was. She had excellent skills and knowledge to do that and to live that out in that way. So I'm just coming back around to this to invite you to perhaps see or use some of this language around your calling into ministry that's distinctive from other people's callings, but their callings are also distinctive from yours. So you can see in the small group if this works or not. I'm going to keep going here for the sake of time. Did I do through? I don't think I did through, did I? I better do through. This is an important one. So we heard this all over the stories of calling that we heard, that our callings are social and communal. While they're for others, they're also through others. So we're utterly dependent upon each other to hear God's calling in our life. And we should be agents of vocation for others in our life. We should be listening for how God might be calling them. Now, because of time, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I'll just give you some food for thought. Across the stories we heard, there were 3 sets of people who had the biggest impact on whether people followed a calling that they heard or not, or that it was blocked or denied. Can you guess who those 3 were? Okay, I'll tell you. Parents, teachers, clergy. Across the board, we heard people say that the hardest stories we heard, the most devastating stories we heard, were stories in which people felt that a parent didn't listen, or that a parent told them no, they couldn't do that, or that a teacher didn't notice or nurture or understand, or that a pastor also maybe put down or didn't recognize or didn't hear what they were trying to say. Of course, on the flip side, the most powerful stories we heard were when one of those 3 sets of people offered encouragement. Parents who told a child, we want you to pursue what will bring you great joy and to do great service in the world, to release them. Or a teacher that noticed this deep love for something in a younger person, or a pastor who called forth a young person to share a gift, or any person across the lifespan to share a gift in their context. Well, I was hoping to give you 10 more minutes, but then I would not be able to get my last prepositions in. Okay, thanks everybody for taking that time to interact around those questions. I'd love to have heard your answers. Just wanted to come back to Patrick Ray's story as a young, poor Hispanic kid in South Los Angeles. And one day he wears a turtleneck, his mom's turtleneck, to school to cover. He had gotten beaten up and he wanted to cover up the bruises, but he gets called out for a dress code violation, gets sent to the dean's office for the day, and he's utterly humiliated. And the dean, who's a Christian brother, recognizes his pain, and he lets him stay in the office all day. And he said, he just sat with me that whole day and gave me this quiet space to exist, to breathe deeply, to feel safe in the space, to remind me that school was a safe place. And they were really dedicated to flourishing me. And then he said, what brought him to see me, to truly see me as I walked across the parking lot? God, his Christian calling? And then Reyes writes, I heard God's voice through this one brother. Through this one brother, I knew I should dedicate my life to the human flourishing of my students. And then he goes on to talk about that. So a really beautiful calling through an important adult in his life. Okay, I want to just do these last few prepositions. And with the preposition from, I've been trying to tease out and think about, when does God call us from something? We always think calling is about to something. But if I want to say callings end in our life, what's the experience there? Have you ever felt like God is calling you from some place, some people, some situation? Even if you don't know where God is calling you to. And that's the struggle, right? You might feel like, I have a very clear sense that this something is ending here. But I would really like to figure out before I leave this, what the next thing is. But, well, of course, we find this with retirement all the time. We'd love to figure out what the rest of those adult years are going to be spent doing. But actually, the call from might be stronger than the call to. And I would say you really can't figure it out until you work through this preposition, I think. I think that it's William Bridgers who says that all transitions begin with an ending. All transitions begin with an ending. So a sign for us, a sense that something's changing, that we're grieving a little, that there's a loss entailed in leaving that position or leaving that community or leaving that set of relationships or that house or whatever it might be, is a real experience of grief and loss. Maybe there's some lamenting there. And well, you guys know all about grief work, so I don't have to tell you about that. Sometimes I do think God is calling us to grief, but then at a point along that journey, God calls us from our griefs, from our losses, into a new way. But there's a big transition there that we have to go through. And sometimes I would add on to this, sometimes God is calling us away from certain conceptions and understandings about God. Sometimes to grow in this, no, not sometimes, often in the spiritual life, to really grow in that relationship, our images, our understandings, our metaphors of God have got to break down, and we've got to reconceive them anew. That's from. Okay, in. With this preposition, I am retrieving Luther, and I'm leaving a lot of Luther behind. So Luther's notion is that God calls us in the place that we are. In the place that we are. But now, as I said, he lived in a medieval, highly stratified society. If you're born the cobbler, you're going to be the cobbler's son. If you're born the prince, you're going to be the prince, or the king or whatever. If you're born, a woman, you're going to be a wife or a nun. It's not, people didn't have choices. They didn't have all this social mobility moving all around and that kind of thing that we live in a highly different kind of social situation. Now, what happened in the Protestant, in the Lutheran tradition, is that conception of calling, certainly by the 19th century, became a way of kind of keeping people in their place. Like, you be obedient to that calling because God gave it to you. And it doesn't really matter if you're an abused factory worker or if you're an abused wife or if you're a worker who's being taken advantage of. That's your calling. You have a duty to do it. So again, that we narrow down, this notion of both God as a caller and what calling is. And of course, people in desperately unhappy situations, you're not going to convince them that, really God's calling them to do this. So I didn't want to retrieve that part of the tradition, but I wanted to retrieve the idea that God calls us in the place that we are. In the place that we are, in places not of our own choosing. So God does call us in places not of our own choosing. And there are many in our lives. I mentioned chronic illness. I didn't choose to have this chronic spinal problem that I do, or a friend that just was diagnosed with MS, or several friends that live for years with cancer. Nobody chooses this, but what's the calling within that experience of being chronically ill, especially for a long time, or caregivers? Let's say my husband becomes chronically ill, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, or I thought my calling was to be a professor, but no, I've got to stop doing that to do this. So, and of course, unemployment or underemployment. So I want to find some language here that says God finds us in that place and may still have a calling for us. Many people that work in jobs in certain kinds of jobs in our society might not work in those jobs because they're a calling. Some people told us, I work in that factory or at Target to support my callings because my main calling is my family. Okay, so God might still be calling them in that place, in that work that they do, but they don't have a strong sense of being called to it, except that it might serve other callings. Okay, Martin, can we pull up that video? I've got a little video here for you.
Let's go ahead.
And that's how I usually define myself, as a baker and a lover. As a baker, because I feel like baking is what I do and what I love doing. And as a lover, I think of myself as called to be a family man, to be a daddy, called to be the support of my household, and called to just love and watch over my family. And not just my family, even at work, that kind of transpired because I cares about the people I work with. I care about their lives. I care about what's going on in their respective homes. You know, that's how God works, and that's how my life has been shaped, to care for people.
Thanks, Martin. That was just a really short clip from Francois' video. If you want to look that up on our website, the story of a immigrant from Africa. He was trained as a sociologist at home, and when he came to America, he couldn't be a sociologist. He couldn't find a job as a sociologist, and he had to wash dishes. And in the rest of his story, if you look at it, he was so ashamed to call home and tell his mother that he was only washing dishes in a kitchen. But the story goes on where someone notices him and asks for his help in making these desserts. And then he becomes really very good at making desserts. And he starts to work in the bakery. And then he goes on to be able to say years later, my calling is to be a baker and a lover. So it's a great story. Okay. Merton says, but with me, it was not to be so. I had to be led by a way that I could not understand and to follow a path beyond my own choosing. You know, several prominent Protestant theologians in the 20th century really emphasized this notion of calling. I had a quote here for you from, I just lost it, sorry. Both Barth and Bonhoeffer emphasized this notion of being called. Bonhoeffer said, vocation is the place of responsibility where we respond to God. So there's still some agency in our choice, but we might not be choosing the place. Barth too said the vocation is the whole of the particularity, the limitation, and the restriction in which each of us meets the divine call and command. So I think both of them really grappling with the constraints on our lives, but it's in those places that we hear God's calling. Okay, I just want to end with this last preposition, within. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you. Within you. And so the very life of God, the very life that we're called is living within us. And so that this preposition within points to these two great mysteries, that God's Spirit abides within us, right? That God calls each of us to abide within the mystery that is God. Our vocations are temporal. They're on this planet, in this time and space, and they end with our deaths. But there's a calling, there's an eternal calling beyond our death to dwell within the very life of God. Okay, well, I'm not sure there's really any time for questions. Andrew, I think we should probably end, huh? I'd be happy to entertain one or two. I know that's a lot of content.